Dram Show with me, Chris Goodrum. As per usual, big thank you to everybody that commented and liked and retweeted and did all the social media stuff for last week's episode of the show. Yeah, I really appreciate it as per usual. It was nice to see retweets from both Two Brewers and Glenora, even though I was maybe not quite so complimentary about some of their bottlings. But I think, you know, I think you guys, and I think they've kind of realised by now that, you know, it's obviously my opinion, and it's an honest opinion, you know, and I always try and be constructive. You're never going to generally hear me say, well, that's absolutely, well, I might actually say that, you never know. I think I probably have, to be honest with you, but I've always said why I think something is good and why certain things are bad. And so, like I said, you know, you're always going to get an honest appraisal from me, shall we say, and like I said, I think pretty much everybody realises that by now anyway. The last couple of episodes of the show have been kind of, I suppose, you know, just for fun, really. But today we're going back to the hard sell, or the soft sell, or you know what I mean. Now, obviously, you may well remember a few episodes of the show ago, I did an episode on Lady of the Glen. They kindly sent me some samples, and it was just the wrong time, just as we hit lockdown, and obviously I couldn't buy anything, but I really want to put something of theirs on the shelf. Obviously, it's got to be worth putting on the shelf, obviously, but this is where you guys come in. Obviously, now if I can sell you some of this before I buy it, then I'm a happy bunny, and everybody's a happy bunny, you know, and we all like to be happy bunnies, don't we, at the end of the day? So yes, obviously some, or maybe all, we shall find out, may well end up on the shelves of Gauntleys in due course, but like I said, you know, you will obviously help me out immensely by sticking your hand in your pocket and saying, yeah, I'll have one of those. So obviously, like I said, it's going to be an honest review, and originally I got sent all bar one of these samples because the current, or the new outrun from Lady in the Glen for their release, and we did a Zoom tasting probably about 3-4 weeks ago now, and if I just find this, interestingly enough, they sent the samples in these, you know, adult Kiora kind of things, pouches. Really intriguing. Only problem is obviously they don't stand up, you know, and you can't see how much juice is in there. So, you know, it's all right, I suppose, if you're just sort of tipping the whole lot into a glass to taste, but when you want to keep a little bit, I mean, thankfully Paul kindly sent me some more juice for this episode of the show, but I had saved some from these, and I had to put them into sort of other bottles just to make sure I kept a bit of juice back. Anyway, so yeah, these are quite cool. Obviously save on postage because they're lighter than a glass bottle, but like I said, they have their limitations. But anyway, that's by the by. So yes, so today we've got 5 of the brand new outrun, and one from an earlier outrun, which Paul kindly sent me a sample of, which was really nice. So big thank you to Lady of the Glen. Hopefully, I mean, you guys already know partially what I think of these because I've already told you, but hopefully you won't be too disappointed with the tasting, and hopefully you guys won't be too disappointed with this tasting, and hopefully you guys will go, oh, I've got to have one of those. So I think I better shut up and just tell you what I'm going to be tasting. Right, so I'm going to kick off with one of the earlier bottlings. This was bottled in January of this year. This is a Glengiri, 11-year-old Glengiri, single bourbon hoggy, 3194, distilled in October of 2008. Like I said, bottled in January of this year at 55.3%. Next bottling we'll be looking at is quite a jump in age statement. This is a 28-year-old Jura. Now, again, single bourbon cask, 1857, distilled in March 1992, bottled in April of this year at 41.2%. Now, interestingly enough, it was quite nice to hear Gregor talk about why certain casks, why he'd done certain things with certain casks, why he'd bought certain casks, and apparently this one was bought on the cheap, shall we say. The ABV was sort of dropping dangerously, and they even thought, I assume they thought it was probably going to be below 40%, but it turns out it was 41.2%. And so he got it on the cheap, and it's priced at, or will go on the shelf at 170.95, which I guess if you think about it, for a 28-year-old whiskey is about half of the course. It's not too expensive. There's a lot more expensive bottlings out there, and we'll get to one of them in due course. So on the face of it, of course, but the value for money looks good. Of course, it all comes down to how good it is, and of course we know we have some issues with Jura, don't we? I mean, it's well documented. And I personally believe it's all basically down to sales. Now, it might sound a bit of a stupid thing to say, but if you take into consideration that back in 2010 Jura was shipping about 350,000 bottles, 10 years later they're selling about 2 million. Now, it doesn't take a genius to figure out that the production has been upped, and I think, and in a lot of the cases, the production goes up, quality goes down, and I think that is big issue that Jura has. And of course, obviously White and Mackay are not going to change anything. They're going to go, well, we're selling 2 million bottles a year, people love our stuff, you know, why should we change? And well, I suppose in essence you can't really argue with that. But talking of expensive, we're moving on to the next bottling, which is a 22-year-old Caperdonich. Single bourbon cask 19130, bottled at 60.5%. My God, that was tight. Or that was being matured in a pretty warm warehouse, shall we say. I think it was only 170 odd bottles, I think, remaining. Anyway, this was distilled in 1997 and bottled in July of this year. Next bottling we'll be looking at is good old Tula Bardines. So this is a 14-year-old. It spent the first 7 years of its life in a bourbon cask, cask 36, and 7 years finishing in ex-rum casks. It was distilled in April of 2006, bottled in May of this year at 55.3%. And then we're going to move on to a couple of sherried ones. This is a Dailuaine. 12-year-old Dailuaine, which spent 9 years in an ex-bourbon cask, 30741, before being finished for 3 years in Pedro Ximenez Hoggy. It was distilled in January of 2008, bottled in May of this year at 56.7%. And the final bottling is a 15-year-old Tomintoul. This initially spent the first part of its life in a bourbon cask and 13 months in ex-Montellado, but the cask 19A, distilled in May of 2005, bottled in June of this year at 55.7%. So that's a lineup. Hopefully, well, it's something that would do for everybody, or you know, apart from obviously a repeated release. But anyway, let's kick off with the Glengiri then, shall we? Right, okay, so 11-year-old Glengiri. Let's see what the nose gives us on this end, shall we? It's quite an interesting nose, in actual fact. It's sort of, initially it feels a lot older than 11 years old, in actual fact. It's got plenty of straw and sort of dried grass, dried heather, barley, and then the youthful element starts coming through and getting that sort of toshiny, rose petally, slightly strawberry moussey kind of character. There's a slight tea leaf note there in the back. I'm guessing obviously this was a pretty refilled bourbon hoggy, because there's very little oak character coming through, so you're kind of getting all the spirit character you're getting. And you know what, I really like it. It's got a slight earthiness to it as well. I like Glengiri. Glengiri has that sort of, you know, slightly sort of strawy, heathery, earthy kind of character, and this is, bar the slight strawberry moussey note, is pretty much spot on Glengiri. It's a little, maybe a little lighter than say the distillery bottling, but for $78.95, which is what it would go on the shelf at, which is, you know, pretty much a fair price for a 14-year-old, well no, it's an 11-year-old, isn't it? 11-year-old cask strength. Maybe it's a touch expensive, possibly, but I like that nose. I think that nose it's just classically Glengiri, which is, what more can you ask for, really? Anyway, let's see what the palate's like. Again, it has an impression of more age than it really has. It's quite malty, strawy, heather, barley, a little bit of honey, slight nuttiness there as well. Again, not a huge amount of oak, so it's very spirit centred. Has a lovely intensity, sort of, again, that kind of straw note kind of lingers throughout, and it's like that strawberry mousse note kind of creeps in toward on the sort of mid palate towards the finish. Just to sort of remind you that it is actually 11 years old and not considerably older than that. It's got some nice spices on the end. The alcohol certainly is kind of like, you know, giving those spices a bit of a jump. I'm going to put a little drop of water with it and see what that does to it. Although, you know, I kind of quite like it without putting a drop of water with it. But we'll see what happens. Oilier, probably quite a little bit less fruity. More of that straw. There's possibly a little bit more oak maybe coming through now. Sort of. Yeah, I'm not quite so keen on it with a drop of water. Let's see what the palate's like. A little sweeter, a little oilier, a little less complex, less spicy. Certainly, I think when it's neat, the alcohol's kind of like really giving that spice notes quite a nice intensity. A little bit less of the Turkish Delight sort of strawberry moussey kind of note, but on the whole I think sort of neat. Yeah, that's not too bad. Okay, so let's move on to the Jura. Now, do you want to hear a rather depressing statistic? Before tasting this particular Jura, I've tasted 45 different independent bottlings of Jura. Have a guess at how many I've rated as being really good. 12. 26% in actual fact. So that basically left, well, you can do the maths out, the percentage that were, shall we say, really not that well. 19 of those were average and 14 were, shall we say, poor, for want of a better word. So I mean, you know, it's a depressing statistic really at the end of the day. So anyway, let's see what this one gives us then, shall we? It's mature. It's got some honey. This obvious oak, old rose petal, straw, a little bit of citrus. It's, I wouldn't say clinging on by its fingertips, but it's kind of like, well, yeah, this was bottled yeah, in the nick of time. The spirit smells old, and like I said, it's, you know, it's not a bad bottling. It's 170 quid. Yeah. No. Yeah. Do you like, I wouldn't quite go as far as saying old knackered whiskey, but, you know, do you like, if you like old whiskey, you know, and never really had an old whiskey before, you know, the price is relatively good. I don't, yeah, it's average. It falls into the average category for me, and I think if well, anyway, let's see what it passes for. It's full, mature, fruity. It's got an edge to it, it has to be said, which is kind of hidden in with that sort of citric kind of character. There's a little bit of oak, a little bit of spice, sort of slightly sweeter spice notes. It's got a reasonable length. I mean, it's not horrendous. It's not a poor bottling of Jura. It's I guess in all essences it's not too bad. Of course, whether it's worth 170 quid, of course, is open to debate. I mean, it's lost a little bit of length, it has to be said. Like I said, it's kind of, it really needed to be bottled. I mean, if, you know, like I said, it's not really quite clinging on with its fingertips, but it's getting close to that kind of point. And so if you like Jura, if you're a Jura aficionado, well, you know, if they can sell 2 million bottles of Jura, somebody's got to like it, haven't they? And you can't afford the sort of like the distillery ridiculously old bottlings. This is not too bad. So so yeah, there you go. Right, moving on to Caperdonich. Now, as you well know, Caperdonich is long since gone, and it's one of those curios of the Scotch whisky industry. In actual fact, it spent more years closed than it did open. I believe, if my research is correct, it spent 42 days in production out of 113. And to be bluntly honest with you, Caperdonich was really blending fodder at the end of the day. I mean, if it was really highly thought of back then, they would have thought to have kept the thing open, but you know, consequently. Anyway, so it's realistically, this is aimed at collectors. It goes on the shelf at $391.95, which you might think is a bit steep, but you know, this is what Caperdonich is going for these days. You know, people have gone through Port Ellen and Brewer and all the other sort of, you know, rather more well-known distilleries, and are now looking at the sort of the distilleries that have gone that are slightly cheaper. You know, and prices are kind of going up. Anyway, let's see what the nose gives us. Quite woody, a lot of oak, coffee. Quite a lot of alcohol, obviously, although it's quite well contained. I mean, it's got that old rose petal, apricot, white fruit, got a nice oakiness to it. I would guess probably first fill bourbon, I would have thought, because it's quite noticeable, the oak character. I mean, it's quite a pleasant nose. I mean, like I've said in the past, I think with Caperdonich you probably have a 50-50 shot of getting a good bottle or a less than good bottle, and that just goes to show you how variable the spirit actually is, or was, as the case may be. And like I said, as most of these end up in collections, it doesn't really matter. You know, you stick it in your collection for a few years and watch the price go up. Yeah, I mean, so this certainly falls into the 50% of good bottlings of Caperdonich. Anyway, let's see what passes out. Again, quite woody, quite alcoholic as well, funnily enough. So a lot of wood spice and tannin, and although there is a lot of wood there, it's something relatively well behaved. You certainly get the mature apricot, a little bit of rose petal, a touch of coffee. It's a bit masked on the finish, which again is not a huge surprise. Going to put a little drop of water with it to see what that does to it. Now, there's always a danger with old spirits that have such a high ABV that you stick a drop of water with it and it just all falls apart. I've done that on so many occasions, but Anyway, let's see what those gives. It's probably brought forward the oak a little more. I'm certainly getting more creaminess, more vanilla. It's brought out a slight oiliness as well. The fruit is kind of dropping off a little bit, so it is kind of showing a little bit more of a slightly industrial character, which is what I often tend to find in the not so great bottlings of Caperdonich. But you know what? But it's not bad. It is what it is. I mean, this is Caperdonich, for God's sake. You know, I wouldn't quite go as far as saying it's a pig's ear, but you know what I mean. You know, as they say, you're not going to make a silk purse out of a pig's ear, are you? Or was it a sow's ear? I don't know. Can't remember. Anyway, let's see what it passes like. Again, still quite oaky. Has a nice mouthfeel to it. The vanillins are coating the mouth. Touch of tannin, a little bit of spice on the finish. Again, not really a great deal of fruit. We're talking more wooden spirit, I suppose, at the end of the day. I mean, and like I said, I mean, I would certainly put this in the sort of like the good 50% category of Caperdonichs. If you want my honest opinion, I think it's probably £90 to £100 too expensive. I certainly not so long ago had an older bottling of Caperdonich from another independent on the shelf, which was pretty damn good, it has to be said, and that was about 100 quid cheaper than this. And personally, I think this is probably, like I said, £90 to £100 too expensive. But like I said, most of this is going to be bought by collectors, and because they can see how the prices of Caperdonich are going up. So who am I to argue with that? So on to the Tullibardine. Now, as you probably well know, in folklore, doing a Tuli is obviously the terminology that has gone into the popular, well, I say popular, into my parlance, shall we say, about being removed or promoted from the Axis of Evil. As you well know, Tullibardine was one of the early members of the Axis of Evil, and certainly when I tasted it in 2008, they were some of the worst bottlings I have ever tasted. And as you well know, history says that when the distillery was sold by White & Mackay, yep, them again, in 2003, the owners found basically warehouses full of shagged casks, and they had to do a Brookladdy. They had to basically do something with it pretty quickly, so they bought in ex-sherry butts, ex-wine casks, and dumped it into that. And in some, and to be honest with you, in some instances, certainly the first load of bottlings I tasted in 2008, they hadn't covered up the fact that the spirit really had been compromised badly by the crap casks it was in. And then, so I kind of like, you know, Axis of Evil had to be, you know, Group E, shall we say. And but then I retasted a couple of years later, I think it was 2010, 2011, the then owners, or the previous owners that bought off White & Mackay, had basically put in place a wood policy, you know, a good wood policy. I mean, prior to that, there was no wood policy. I mean, it was all blending fodder anyway, and nobody wanted, anyway. So 2 years down the line, it was chalk and cheese. I mean, all right, you're never going to get away from the fact that Tullibardine is a slightly sub-industrial, slightly rough, slightly ready kind of spirit. But as I've always said, if you have that kind of style of spirit, bit of sweetness, bit of oak, something, you know, always helps to kind of like, you know, balance that characteristic. So, so like I said, the distillery tends to do a lot of wood finishing still these days. So let's see what this one's like. Obvious rum cask influence straight off the bat. Rummy dried fruits, brown sugar, earthy wood spice, bit of pepper, bit of nutmeg. touch of industrial character. I mean, you can't argue that Tullibardine doesn't have the character to withstand, you know, a lot of oak. It certainly does. And you know what, I think this is really well balanced. Like I said, it has the character of the spirit and the balancing character of the wood. And as I've said, you know, Tullibardine's character is Tullibardine's character. You know, it's a like or hate, or love or hate kind of thing. And like I said, I really quite like this. I think this is perfect. I think, you know, if you want to experience something more rougher spirit, you know, then, you know, why not? Now this is just a shade under 80 quid, 79.95, and I think that's worth it. I've got no issues with this. Well, let's taste it first and then I'll see. Again, it kicks off with the rummy dried fruits, the wood spice, a little bit of almost potpourri. Again, there's that slight industrial character, slight rose petal, slight roughness, but again balanced by the rum, the sweetness of the rummy fruit. Really balances it up quite nicely, and so in essence this has loads of character. You know, it is a really entertaining whiskey at the end of the day. It's certainly not something you're going to forget in a hurry. It's not homogenous, it's not bland. Okay, you'd have to like the character of Tullibardine, but like I said, if you've never experienced Tullibardine before, then that's as good as any, I think. I'm not going to bother putting any water. Well, yes, I will put a little drop. I don't think it needs it. Again, I mean, it's 55%, and I like the intensity of the alcohol because it is really kind of ramping up all the wood, all the distillery character. Yeah, so putting a drop of water seems to bring the emphasis more to the rum cask. It's softer, it's got less rawness. Some might argue that's not a bad thing in actual fact, but yeah, I do like it a little bit raw on occasions, it has to be said. See what the pulse like now. Again, there's a lot more rum cask character now, a lot sweeter, softer, less distillery character, although it does still come through right there on the finish. You know, it's still got that edge to it to remind you of what distillery this actually is. There's a bit of almost kind of green fruit, green apple, such sourness as well on the finish. You know, personally, like I said, I think with water I really, really like that. So, so yeah, great one. Okay, so let's move on to the Dailuaine. So this is 12 years old, which 3 years of which was in an ex Pedro Ximenez Hoggy. So yeah, not a huge amount of colour, good. So we're hoping for not a huge amount of sherry character. Now, I mean, I like Dailuaine. It's not one of the most well-known of distilleries, and it's got quite an interesting history. It's what I call the classic Swiss Army knife distillery. It's changed its character many times over the years. I mean, back in the 1800s, they were using wooden condensers, so one imagines the character was pretty earthy, pretty sulphury, pretty meaty, and malty. I think in the 20s they basically put in stainless steel condensers, so I imagine the character was roughly about the same. And then it wasn't until I think 2005, 2006 that they then put in copper condensers, and again changed the character of the spirit to a more classically spey, lighter and fresher, although I still find that Dailuaine tends to have a bit of a maltiness. So we're talking sort of modern Dailuaine here. and I believe that I think I read that in 2014 again Diageo tweaked the character because they basically put on hold the expansion to Klein Elish, and of now using sort of Dailuaine to produce a more Klein Elish like sort of waxy kind of spirit. So it's kind of hung around as a distillery purely because of it's a Swiss Army knife. Anyway, let's see what the nose on this is like then, shall we? Obvious PX straight off the bat, winey, dried fruits, a bit of spice, sweet spice, raisinated fruit. But, and here's the but, it still retains that sort of malty character that I associate with Dailuaine, although, as I've just said, this is more modern style Dailuaine. And there is a bit of grassiness, there's a bit of citrus. And you know what, I like the balance on this. It is not too OTT on the sherry, and as you well know, balance is one of the key things that I look for in a whisky. And on the nose, yeah, okay, this is how I like my sherry. Relatively subtle because there is quite a fair amount of it still. So, you know, I think it's going to appeal to you guys that sort of like your sherry. Yeah, even a bit of creamy American oak just wafting through now with a bit of time. So, see what the pants like. Quite malty, biscuity again. Opens up with a PX kind of character, the slight winey dried fruits, grapey. But again, some nice maltiness on the mid palate, a little bit of smoke on the finish. I'm guessing probably more charred oak rather than actual smoke. Bit of spice, bit of treacle, dried fruit, bit of American oak. Bit of maltiness. Yeah, I mean that is actually really pretty well balanced again at the end of the day. And like I said, I probably didn't say, I don't think it actually needs any water in reality. I don't know, maybe that's me. Maybe I'm just kind of used to drinking or tasting spirits of this kind of ABV, but I personally don't think that needed any water. I like the intensity. A little bit of water kind of brings out more of the sherry, I would say. It's got an almost meatiness now, which maybe it's the sherry, because like I said, this shouldn't be. This should be the more modern style of Dailuaine, and there is a. Again, there's still a reminder of the sort of like slight citric character, the sort of spey kind of character. So, see what the pants like now. Yeah, maybe a little bit more emphasis on the sherry cask. Still quite broad, quite malty. Mouth filling, longer now. Maybe a little less of the American oak influence, possibly. But I think sort of neat, personally. Like I said, I think the balance on that was pretty damn good. So, yeah. Oh, by the way, it's $88.95. Should you wish to purchase a bottle. I mean, yes, you can argue that's a little expensive for a 12-year-old. But you know what, I like that. I'd quite happily sell that to you for that amount of money. Right, and finally on to the 15-year-old Tomintoul. So, for 13 months in an ex-Amontillado, but that is pretty damn dark, and it's got that slight sort of olive green sherry kind of character. Amontillado often has that sort of slight olivey kind of colour. So let's stick my nose in the glass. green nuts, raw sherry, dried fruit, and that's about it really. I mean, it's a sherry monster at the end of the day. There's a bit of walnut, a bit of prune, a bit of spice. It's not my thing. It's all sherry. I'm not getting any Tomintoul character, and it's £131.95. Now, if you like your sherry monsters, this is going to be up your street. For me, I much prefer the Dailuaine. I think that's got a lot better balance. This is just all sherry, and it just goes to show you, only spent 13 months in an Amontillado butt. It just shows you how quickly the cask can overwhelm the spirit. Anyway, let's see what the pals are. No surprise, it's pretty much like the palate. It's all sherry, it's green nuts, it's dried fruit. Now, I like Amontillado finishes. It's good to see things other than Oloroso, and it doesn't have the leafy Oloroso kind of character. It has that sort of slightly richer dried fruit. I think off the top of my head, I think the Amontillado is an aged Fino, I think, if I remember my sherry classifications correct. And it has a slight, well, more than a slight saltiness on the finish, but again, it's all Amontillado, it's all sherry. It's like there's no spirit character, there's no distillery character. It's very clean, I'll give it that. There's no sulphur. For £131, I really want a little bit more, to be bluntly honest with you. I mean, it's not a bad whiskey if you like that style of whiskey, but like I said, I think I would much rather have the Dailuaine. So anyway. Okay, I seem to have waffled an inordinate large amount today. I'm going to have to quickly wrap up. Love the Glengiri. I mean, that really was a lovely whiskey, and for the price, I'm quite happy with that. It had plenty of the distillery character, and showed a little bit more maturity than you would normally expect an 11-year-old whiskey to show. The Jura, like I said, it's not the worst Jura I've ever come across in my entire life, and I suppose for 170 quid for 28-year-old spirit is not too bad. Just let me know if you think so as well. I mean, yeah, it was okay at the end of the day. Average, I suppose, is probably, the spirit was average anyway. The Caperdonich, like I said, again, it's going to go in a collection, so I think it's slightly overpriced for what it actually is quality-wise. But like I said, I suppose you look at the market for these kind of things and you price it accordingly. Yeah. The Tullibardine, you know what, I think pretty much my favourite whiskey of the day, in actual fact. Probably, there's probably a toss-up between that and the Glengiri, it has to be said. And because it just shows, how judicious finishing really can add something to the character of a whiskey. And certainly if the whiskey has a certain character, a certain strength of character, it can balance it up quite nicely. So you know what, yeah, I'm quite happy with that. I really like that. The Dailuaine, and again I thought the Dailuaine was pretty good, pretty well balanced. It's going to appeal to sort of like you guys that like your sherry, and it's going to appeal to people like me that prefer a little bit more balance. So again, possibly a bit on the pricey side, but I guess this is the current situation that we live in. And the Tomintoul, okay, Paul asked me to be kind about it, and I will say that the quality is good. There's no sulphur, there's no off notes, there's nothing like that. It's just not really to my taste, and I think it's probably overpriced for what it actually is as well, to be honest with you. But there you go. I guess that's how much they had to pay for the cask, I suppose. But anyway, so on the whole, like I said, I think when I last reviewed Lady of the Glen's releases, no real difference to any other independent bottling. Some good stuff and some, it's some good stuff, and I'm more than happy to put some of this on the shelf. I really am, and I suggest that certainly the Tullibardine and the Dailuaine are certainly worth going for. So until then, good afternoon and good ramming. And I picked up the Jura.